Okay, so I'm chairing the session, and thank you very much for putting it together. And I'm going to abuse my chairman's prerogative by speaking first, and for as long as I can, because I know that once you start hearing Judith and Henry, you're not going to want to hear from me again. So we'll get cracking, because we're also under a bit of a time constraint. So a bit of corporate advertising first and foremost. The idea for the session, and specifically what I want to talk about, came from sort of an off-the-cuff conversation with Tim.
Sorry, is it possible, the mic is going to work for TV?
Okay.
Do you want me to sit there and click things as you tell me?
Yes, click, yep.
Okay.
The idea for this came from an off-the-cuff conversation with Tim, more or less, about the ideas around taxes and subsidies and tax expenditures and along those lines. And we're sort of saying there's a great deal of diversity of views and opinion within the Libertarian movement as to taxation. And we thought, well, we would kind of put it together in an idea to see, well, why are the statists winning when it comes to issues of taxation? So that's sort of what I want to address. Slide, please. Now, just the other day, there's an article in the Australian Financial Review by Chris Richardson, and he said, the federal budget is Australia's compact with itself. As a nation, we raise taxes on companies and workers to spend on subsidies. Okay, that was why we tax and spend, to provide subsidies. And certainly we see this attitude creeping in very much. A few weeks ago, Adam Crichton had an article about who pays what. And he was criticised by Professor Quiggin at the University of Queensland, where Quiggin said, well, we spend the money on ourselves. So there's no problem if we have a massive deficit because we've spent the money on ourselves. Well, actually that's not quite right. Slide, please. So I would actually say that we tax and spend to spend money on public goods. Now, at the expense of being somewhat heartless, I'm not convinced that subsidies on the aged and the young and the sick and the poor and all those good things are in fact public goods. I'm always thinking sort of in terms of national defence, police, prisons, and beyond that I'm kind of stumped as to what is a public good. Slide, please. But more or less what we face, and we're very aware of this as libertarians, is over-government. Government does far too much compared to what we think government should be doing, spending money on education, universities and stuff, which it shouldn't be doing. And more or less, here's the thing. In the very bad old days and through to the present, a lot of people believe that tax is a good deal. Money disappears, arrives in Canberra by magic, and they spend it on goodies, and we are all better off if we pay more tax. And the idea is that this is a good deal, but more and more people are coming to the view that maybe it's not as good as it could be. Slide, please. So, I love these little matrices, and what we have here is, well, should we have coercion, and is it a public good or not? And I'm probably going to upset about half the audience and say, well, some coercion in the payment of income tax is a good idea because then we do get those public goods that we need. Lack of coercion would lead to a free rider problem, which we're well aware of, but we don't ever pay enough attention to that disputed territory, where the government is using coercion to pay for goods and services that are not public goods, that we can legitimately say, we don't want government to do something about this. But even here, slide please, there is a variation of opinions amongst even free market academics. Hayek says, well, government can do more or less what it likes as long as it follows a given set of rules. Yeah? Mises, however, says absolutely not. Spending anything in that disputed area is an evil. And Buchanan has a bob each way where he says, well, some extensions of power are more or less more valuable or less valuable than others in terms of legitimacy. Slide, please. Now, how does the state get away with all this over government? How does it get away with all these things that we don't really want? And two arguments. First of all is fiscal illusion. We get duped. The state lies. We know this. but they obfuscate as to the true cost of government. For example, the Medicare levy. We all think, gee, what a great deal, we are getting a mega health service for 1.5% of our income. But in actual fact, it costs a lot more. As libertarians, we should be advocating for, well, three things. One, privatised healthcare across the board. But secondly, that only 1.5% of our income gets spent on Medicare. Or thirdly, that the true cost of Medicare gets reflected in the levy. Okay, one of those three outcomes is what we should be advocating for. So, fiscal illusion works through tax complexity, where you have a judge in the federal court saying that opening up the Tax Act is like opening a door to another dimension. That is a serious problem. Deficit finance and hypothecated taxes are terrible ideas, especially in Australia, where they are constitutionally forbidden. So when we have the Medicare levy, it is not going into a bucket called Medicare, it's going into consolidated revenue. Then we have tax folk theories, which I want to talk about today, spend a bit of time. Widely held views about the principles of good taxation, I should have put good in scare quotes, that are probably just not true. Where do they come from? Well, first of all, fiscal illusion is itself a source of folk theories. Secondly, the political debate. And thirdly, economics, both high theory and what I've called low theory. So what people think they understand when they do an economics course. So here's my favourite one. The rich don't pay their fair share of taxes. Now the backstory of this is an article in the Australian by the former, or the then Shadow Treasurer Wayne Swan, where he said that poor are paying more of the income tax burden than anybody else. And I looked at this and I thought that can't be right. So what I've been doing over the last few years is actually just analysing the share of revenue, of net tax revenue going to the government by the top 25%, the middle 50%, and the bottom 25% of taxpayers. And what we see is that the rich, the uber rich, people earning about $80,000 a year or more, who are being asked to dip into their pockets to share the burden, actually already pay 67% of all the net income tax. Okay. The middle crowd, pardon me, pay very little. Okay. So the rich, those evil rich people, are already paying heaps of the net income tax. That is a graph that we should look at more often, and that is from Thursday of this week with the very latest figures that came out on Wednesday. Slide, please. Then another one is that we should tax all sources of income, because otherwise we would end up with some or other distortion in the economy, or people would get away with not paying their fair share, irrespective of compliance and nuisance costs. Well, this is from the Henry Review, where he actually found that there are 125 taxes in Australia at all levels of government, of which 10 of them raise 90% of all the revenue. That means there are 115 taxes out there that are nuisance taxes, that impose burden and burdens on the economy in terms of compliance costs, nuisance costs, don't raise very much revenue, that can be and should be abolished. Slide, please. Another one, very common these days, not being taxed is a subsidy. Now, this is astonishing, and we see this in the so-called tax expenditure statement that, I have to say, at Cat Lake Sea Files we've been running a campaign against them for years, and Judith has actually had some glorious victories which she documented in an article in the Australian a couple of weeks ago about how they are backing away. How they are backing away from some of the more egregious ideas. For example, you should be taxed for owning your own home. This is a very popular idea in Canberra, probably because they don't own their own homes in Canberra, they're all on the lease. But you should be taxed if you are an owner-occupier of your own house. Very, very popular idea, absolutely shocking. When at the Henry Review, Henry Ergus and I actually went to the conference, and we were the only two sane people. There must have been hordes of tax economists all sniggering about how stupid Australians are, that they don't understand that a housing tax would be such a good idea. And I was sitting there thinking, please, 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 come out in public and say that. Superannuation benefits accrue to high income earners. Well, duh. It is a progressive income tax system. That is how the system is designed to operate. This isn't a bug, this is a feature of how our tax system operates. Negative gearing is a rort. Well, actually no. Negative gearing is the expensing of expenditure incurred in the production of taxable income. If you want to get rid of negative gearing, by all means, you also need to get rid of the capital gains tax. Otherwise, you're double dipping. Now, getting rid of the capital gains tax is a good idea anyway. And then most importantly, tax expenditures are arbitrary exercises in wishful thinking. Economists get to play God and design their own ideal tax system without having to worry about democratic constraints. They just make it up. Really, go and have a look at the tax expenditure statement. It is an appalling document. Slide, please. Economic incidence means that making bad choices doesn't matter. They say, well, it doesn't really matter which side of the market you tax because incidence will work its way through and the tax will end up falling where it should fall. People who make that argument, that's fine, also then end up complaining about salary sacrificing. Now, salary sacrificing occurs because the fringe benefits tax is paid by the company and not the employee. If you want to take away the salary sacrifice industry, you would simply shift the tax to the other side of the market. Payroll tax is a tax on jobs. Doesn't matter what you learned in second year micro. Slide, please. Big business. Big business doesn't pay its fair share. Now, this is by a paper by myself and Richard Keeney at the University of Western Australia, where what we did was we estimated effective tax rates, control for everything else, and we have that very nice S-shaped graph where basically company tax in Australia is paid by the very, very largest of businesses. Not small business. Company tax in Australia is paid, the overwhelming bulk of it, by large business. It is a burden on large business, and the compliance and nuisance costs are a burden on small business. Slide, please. Land tax is an efficient tax. This is wrong on so many levels. Please get this out of your heads. First of all, the only time you will ever face an inelastic supply curve in your whole life is the fact that you only have one life. Okay. Every other inelastic supply curve just doesn't exist. The other thing is, I've made this argument in Parent Society a couple of years ago, we don't want efficient taxes. We don't want it to be easy for the government to skin us alive. We want it to be hard for them to skin us alive. And the way you do that is by having inefficient taxes. Slide, please. Okay, so conclusion. I'll probably run way over time, but I'm the chairman and that's fine. Don't believe statements about taxation that are commonly held, that are pronounced by experts, especially neoclassical economists. Check all statements yourself. There are very, very few areas of low-hanging fruit in the area of taxation. There's very few sources of untaxed revenue. There are very few easy revenue changes that will generate lots of income. When thinking about tax policy, always think about Harold Demsitz's Nirvana fallacies. There are no free lunches. People can't be different. The grass isn't greener. When thinking about policy, also think about what are the compliance costs, what are the audit costs, and what are the behavioral assumptions. The audit costs and the compliance costs are higher than you think, and the behavioral responses will be bigger than you think. Thank you very much.